The first thing I noticed was that my wolves were not where I had left them. I had ridden 3 days from the Calder seat at Ashenveld, through the pale grass plateau of Veyrath, with 3 of my lead pack at heel, Bryn, who had run with me longer than most mountains had stood, Fen, his son, and the young she-wolf Lyra, fast as river water and twice as cold to strangers. They were my border scouts. I had brought them because Veyrath was disputed land, the seam between my territory and the lesser pack of Moldrath to the south, and a dispute on the seam meant I needed noses I trusted. I had not brought them to sit at someone's door. They were there when I crested the last rise, all 3 of them, in a line, settled on their haunches before a shepherd's cottage of gray field stone. Not alert, not guarding, settled the way a wolf settles when it has decided a place belongs to it, when it has weighted the air and found it right. Bryn's great silver head was turned toward the cottage's open shutter. His tail, which I had not seen move without reason in 40 years, moved. I pulled up my horse and looked at this for a long moment. 300 years I had run Veyrath's patrol. 300 years, or close enough to it that the difference was only bookkeeping, and I had never once seen Bryn settle before a stranger's door. Bryn had stood at the gates of Ashenveld itself while I crowned my father's council and had not so much as blinked. He was not a wolf who settled. He was not, if I am honest, a wolf who moved at all except when he chose to, which was rare and deliberate and always correct. I dismounted slowly. Bryn's ear swiveled toward me. He did not rise. "What is this?" I said, mostly to myself, and walked forward. The door of the cottage was open. Not carelessly, open the way a door is open when the person inside has nothing to hide and no interest in pretending otherwise. The smell that came out of it was herbs and wood smoke and something green, something like the forest floor after rain. My wolf, which I have learned over 3 centuries to listen to the way other men listen to their elders, went very, very still. Not still the way it goes still before a threat, still the way it goes still before something it recognizes. I did not have time to think about that, because a woman came to the door. She was not what I expected. Veyrath disputes drew settlers of a particular stripe, stubborn, territorial, sharp-eyed, ready with a claim and a grievance. I had evicted a dozen of them in the past century. They always met me the same way, feet planted, jaw forward, the particular posture of someone who has rehearsed their argument and intends to deliver it. This woman stood in the doorway with her arms loosely at her sides and a sprig of something purple and fragrant in one hand, and she looked at me the way she might look at a rain cloud, interested, assessing, unbothered. She was not young exactly, but she was not old either, dark-haired, eyes the color of still water at dusk. Her dress was plain wool, earth-colored, and her hands were stained faintly green at the fingernails from whatever she'd been sorting. She looked at me. She looked at my wolves with something that was not fear and not performance, but simple acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge old friends when you've been expecting them. Then she looked back at me. "You will be Calder," she said, not a question. Her voice was even, not afraid, not defiant, simply even the way a person is even when they are comfortable with whatever comes next. I said nothing for a moment, because I was not accustomed to being named before I'd spoken, and because my wolf was still doing that quiet, searching thing beneath my ribs, and because Bryn had turned his full silver head toward her and was watching her the way he watches things he considers important. "I am," I said, "and you are occupying disputed land under a settlement order you have not answered in 3 months." She looked at the sprig in her hand, turned it once slowly. "The order came at first frost," she said. "The pass was closed. I couldn't have answered it if I'd wanted to. It is now second frost. The pass has been open 6 weeks. Yes, she did not argue this. She simply acknowledged it, the way she'd acknowledged everything else, as though the world's facts were interesting rather than threatening. I've been treating a wolf with a broken foreleg. I didn't want to move her until she could bear weight. I looked past her through the open door. In the corner of the cottage's single room, on what had once been a sleeping mat, my sleeping mat, from a patrol cache, I noted, which meant she'd been in the cache, which meant she'd known this was pack land from the first, lay one of my border wolves. A gray female I recognized. She'd been missing from patrol count for 11 weeks, which my scout captain had logged as a probable death. She was not dead. She was lying on her side with her foreleg wrapped in some kind of splinted bandage, and she was watching Saren with the same settled attention that Bryn wore outside. I stood in the doorway of a cottage that smelled of herbs and patience, looking at a wolf I had mourned as lost, whole and alive on a mat that was not hers, watched over by a woman I had come to remove, and I had the distinct and unfamiliar sensation of not being entirely certain what to say. "Her name," I said at last, "the wolf." Saren looked at her. "I've been calling her Ash." "Her name is Kara." Something moved in her face, brief, warm. "Then I've been calling Kara Ash for 11 weeks. I apologize." She glanced at me. "To both of you." I looked at Kara. Kara's tail, slow and steady, moved once against the mat. "You have," I said, 3 days. After 3 days I will return with a formal expulsion order, and you will leave Veyrath or be escorted out of it." She nodded, not resigned, not frightened, simply accepting the way you accept weather. "And you will not," I said, "go into the patrol cache again." "I replaced everything I took," she said. "The splinting wood, the cloth, the rations. I left a count in the cache log." I stared at her for a moment. Then I turned and walked back to my horse. Bryn did not move until I was mounted. Then he rose slowly, unhurriedly, looked once more at the woman in the doorway, and followed me up the rise. I told myself, riding back toward the patrol camp I'd established at Veyrath's northern edge, that this was a simple matter. A woman on disputed land. 3 days, an order, an escort. Clean, straightforward, the kind of thing I had done dozens of times without losing a night's sleep. My wolf did not comment on this. It simply held that unfamiliar quiet, patient as deep water in the space behind my ribs. I went back the next morning. I told myself it was to check the status of the border markers on the eastern seam, which was true, and which happened to bring me within half a mile of the cottage, which I told myself was coincidental. I found Saren in the rough pasture behind the cottage with 2 of Finn's pack daughters at her feet and a 3rd wolf. One of mine, a patrol yearling I did not recognize at first because his gray coat had gone dull with what looked like a skin complaint, lying on his side while she worked something into his fur with steady, careful hands. She heard me coming. She did not look up immediately. She finished the pass she was making along the wolf's flank, said something to him quietly, too quiet for me to catch, and then sat back on her heels and looked at me. "Calder," she said, the same way she'd said it yesterday, level, warm, with no particular performance of either deference or challenge. "You are treating Veth's patrol yearling," I said, naming the wolf. She looked at the animal beside her. I didn't know his name. "Sable." I dismounted and crouched at a reasonable distance, looking at the wolf's coat. "How long has he had the mite complaint?" "Since I found him about a month ago. It's almost clear now." She looked at her hands. The herb stain was different today, something darker, oily. "It's a lavender and clove preparation. It works, but it takes daily application. My healers at Ashenveld have not been able to shift this strain of mite complaint in 3 years, I said. "Your healers at Ashenveld," she said, "are probably treating the symptom rather than the cause. The mite prefers a particular soil fungus. Clear the fungus on the wolf's den ground and the mite can't re-establish." I looked at her. She looked back at me, steady and unconcerned, not boasting, simply explaining the way a person explains when they know something and see no reason to be coy about it. "Where did you learn this?" I asked. "My mother, and before her, her mother." A small movement at the corner of her mouth, almost a smile. "We have always treated wolves." I thought about Kara inside. About 11 weeks of patient, careful attention from a woman with no obligation and no reward. About a cash log meticulously kept. You knew, I said, this was pack land. Yes. You stayed regardless. Kara couldn't be moved. She met my eyes, no flinching, no excuse. I knew what that might mean. I stayed anyway. She said this simply, the way she said everything, not as though she was making herself brave. As though the choice had simply not been a difficult one. As though a wolf who needed help was sufficient reason, and questions of whose land and whose law were secondary concerns that would sort themselves out. Something moved in me that I did not immediately name. I have had 300 years of learning to be careful with the things that move in me, because a king who reacts before he understands is a danger to his pack. So I did not name it. I stood up, looked at the eastern seam markers across the pasture, and said nothing else of consequence. But I did not leave immediately. I watched her work for a while, the careful, methodical passes of her hands along Sable's flank, the way the yearling's breathing slowed under her touch, the way Fenn's daughters had arranged themselves at the edge of the pasture as though keeping watch. Wolves do not keep watch for people they do not trust. This is a simple fact of pack behavior, and I know it as well as I know anything. Fenn's daughters did not know this woman. They had no reason to trust her, and yet there they were, patient and settled, as though she was someone who belonged in their orbit. I was aware, distantly, that my own wolf felt the same. I said the mite complaint, is the treatment dangerous to the wolf? No, lavender and clove are both gentle. The proportions matter, too much clove and you irritate the skin, but at the concentration I'm using it's safe. She glanced up. You could take the formula for your healers at Ashenveld. I considered her for a moment. I will return tomorrow, I said, with writing materials. She nodded and went back to her work. Riding back to camp, I turned this over in my mind, the mite formula, and the reason I had agreed to return for it, and whether those two things were the same reason, and whether I was certain they were. My wolf offered no opinion. It simply held that warm, still attention, patient as it had been the evening before, as though it had already decided something and was waiting without urgency for me to catch up. On the second day, I brought writing materials and stayed for 2 hours. She walked me through the preparation, measurements, timing, application method, the soil treatment for the den ground, and I wrote it down in my border log, which felt both practical and, in some way I did not examine closely, like an excuse. The wolf Sable lay between us with his head on his paws and his amber eyes moving from her face to mine with the interested calm of an animal that has decided two things are not a threat to each other. We talked about the Veyrath border while I wrote. She knew its history, the original pack grant, the Moldrath dispute, the 3 treaty attempts. She had been in Veyrath before, she said, years ago, passing through with her mother. She remembered the plateau's particular grass, the way the wind came from the south in autumn with a smell of far-off rain. You have been a traveler, I said. A herb woman follows what grows, she said, and what grows follows the seasons. And where do you return to? She was quiet for a moment, sorting a handful of dried herbs into small pouches with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Wherever I've been lately, not said with self-pity, simply with truth. I did not ask more than that, but I noted it, the way you note a thing that matters before you've decided why it matters and stored it somewhere quiet. When I rose to leave, Bryn, who had settled himself at the cottage wall again and spent the 2 hours watching Saren with that grave, considering gaze of his, lifted his great head and looked at me. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at me again with an expression I had not seen on his face in a very long time. I knew that expression. I had seen it rarely, perhaps 4 or 5 times in the centuries we had run together. It was the expression Bryn wore when he was waiting for me to understand something that he already understood, something he had already decided was true, something he was too patient and too dignified to simply tell me, but too honest to hide. I looked at him for a long moment. "Come," I said quietly. He rose and followed, but slowly, and he looked back once. On the third morning I woke before dawn with a dream I did not remember and a feeling in my chest like the moment before lightning. Not the lightning itself, not the strike, but the held breath of the air before it, charged and still and inevitable. I lay in my camp bunk for a while, looking at the canvas above me, while my wolf turned slow circles under my ribs in a way I had not felt in. I counted backward honestly, and gave up because the number was too large and the fact of it too strange. My wolf had not been restless in a long time, not like this. It had been steady, dependable, a deep hum beneath my daily life, present, constant, but not like this. Not like something waking up after a long sleep, not like something stretching long muscles and finding them still sound. I got up and went to the edge of camp and looked south toward the plateau. The sun was not yet above the ridge. The grass was silver with frost. Somewhere in the direction I was looking, a wolf I had known for 3 centuries was sitting at a cottage door, watching. I thought about a woman sorting herbs with green-stained hands, about a wolf she had kept alive for 11 weeks, about the way she said my name, not with fear, not with flattery, not with performance of any kind, simply with the directness of someone who did not consider deception worth the effort. I thought about what Bryn's expression had meant the night before. I thought about how many times in 300 years I had seen it, and about how I had never once been wrong to trust it. Then I rode south. I found her in the pasture again. Early, the frost still thick on the grass. She was crouched beside Kara, who had been brought outside for the first time, and who was placing careful, experimental weight on the mended foreleg. I watched from the rise. Saren's hand was against Kara's flank, steady and still, not guiding, only present, the way you are present for something that needs to find its own balance. Kara tested the leg, then tested it again, then put full weight on it, stood for a breath, looked back at Saren. Saren said something I was still too far to hear, and her hand moved along Kara's back once, warm and brief. I felt it like a fist around my heart, not painful, tender. The way you feel something you have been waiting to feel for so long that you have almost stopped noticing the waiting. I rode down. Kara heard me first, turned, alert, then relaxed when she placed my scent. She came toward me, limping slightly but walking, and I crouched and put my hand against her jaw, and she pressed into it with the trust of a wolf who has decided an absence was not abandonment. "She's walking well," Saren said from where she stood. Yes, I looked at Kara. At the careful bandaging changed recently I could tell by the smell, at the way the foreleg bore weight, at 11 weeks of patient, invisible work. She is. I straightened and looked at Saren across the small distance between us. "Today is the 3rd day," she said. She was not accusing. She was simply noting it, the way she noted everything. "Yes," I said. She looked at the cottage, at the plateau around her, the frost grass, the gray stone walls, the pale sky going gold at the eastern ridge. She had the expression of someone taking a last look at something they have valued. Quiet, composed, no bitterness and no pretense that it did not cost her. Something in me went entirely still. I had come this morning with the expulsion order in my saddlebag. I had written it the previous evening in the precise, formal language of pack law. I had done everything correctly, and I was standing in a frost-silver pasture watching a woman prepare, with great dignity and no complaint, to leave a place she had made into something, and I could not make myself reach for the saddlebag. I thought about why. I thought about Bryn. I thought about the feeling in my chest the night before. I thought about the way my wolf had been awake, and turning, and warm, in a way it had not been in 3 centuries. And then quietly, without drama, the way truly important things often arrive, I understood. I had been a king for a very long time. I had been an alpha for longer than most packs' recorded histories. I knew what the mate bond felt like in the abstract. Every wolf blood knew it, the way you know what fire is even if you have never burned. I knew its theory. I knew its shape. I had simply never expected it to arrive at second frost in a disputed land pasture, brought in by 3 of my own wolves before I'd so much as learned the woman's family name. I stood with this understanding for a moment, long enough to be certain of it, short enough not to overthink it. Then I looked down at my right hand. The mate mark lies beneath the skin. You cannot see it. Most of the time, it is potential rather than presence, waiting for the bond to close. I had looked at that patch of skin on the inside of my wrist perhaps twice in 3 centuries, in the way you look at something you have decided is theoretical. Now it was gold. Not bright, not blazing, not dramatic. A warm, deep gold like firelight through amber, steady, present, as though it had been there all along and I had simply not been looking. I looked up at Saren. She was looking at her own wrist. Her expression was very still, not frightened, not overwhelmed. Something between wonder and recognition, the way you recognize a word in a language you thought you had forgotten. She raised her eyes to mine. In the pasture around us, without command, without sound, without any signal I had given, 6 of my pack wolves moved into a circle, not threatening, encircling, the way the pack encircles something that belongs to it. Bryn walked through them from the direction of the cottage. He crossed the pasture at a slow, deliberate pace and stopped in front of Saren. He was the largest wolf I owned, silver gray, old as deep forest, with eyes the color of winter sky. In 3 centuries, he had bowed his head to 4 things. Me, my father's father, and once, in a moment that my pack still speaks of, to a dying lunar elder whose name we carved in the stone at Ashenveld's gate. He bowed his head to Saren. Not a quick dip, a full, slow, considered bow, head low, held there for 3 long breaths. I watched this happen. I had thought perhaps that seeing it would surprise me. But the thing about understanding something true is that once you understand it, it stops being surprising. It simply is. It simply always was. You were the one who was late. Saren stood very still while Bryn bowed. She did not move or speak. Her free hand, the one without the mark, lowered slowly and came to rest, featherlight, on the top of Bryn's great silver head. He held the bow for a breath longer. Then he straightened, turned, and settled himself at her left side with the unhurried authority of a wolf who has been waiting a long time to be where he belonged. I did not speak immediately. I had a rule, developed over 3 centuries and any number of moments requiring careful handling, that the first words you say to something important should be the right ones. I had not always managed this. I had managed it more often than I had failed at it, which was good enough for a long life. I looked at Saren. She was looking at Bryn's head under her hand with an expression I could not entirely name, something between moved and careful, the way a person looks when they are holding something new and true and are not yet certain what to do with it. I owe you, I said, an explanation. She looked up. What you are feeling, I said, and then I stopped and chose the next words carefully because they were the most important words in any wolf's understanding, is the mate bond. It is what our kind calls a fated mate, a destined pairing. The wolves know it before we do. I glanced at Bryn, often significantly before we do. She looked at her wrist, at the gold beneath the skin. Is it permanent? It is a recognition, I said. It is not a command. I held her eyes because this mattered. I want to be clear about that. What the bond says and what you choose are not the same thing. The bond says we are matched. What happens after that is entirely yours to decide. She was quiet for a moment. The wolves around us were still, patient, attending. You came to remove me, she said. Yes. And now? I reached into my saddlebag and took out the expulsion order. I looked at it, the formal language, the pack seal, everything correct. Then I folded it once and again and held it in my hand for a moment. Then I crouched and pressed it into the frost-black earth at the pasture's edge, under a flat stone, where it would soften with the damp and the season until there was nothing left of it but the idea of an order that had not been carried out. I looked at her. "Now," I said, "I have a question, and I want you to answer it without considering what answer would please me, because I have been an alpha long enough to find flattery useless and honesty precious." She nodded, her eyes were steady. "You have been here 3 months," I said. "You have treated my wolves, kept my cash log, and stayed through a closed pass and a settlement order. Not because someone asked you to, not for payment or position, simply because there was need and you could answer it." I paused. "Is this place, Varath, a place you would choose, if the choice were free?" She looked at the plateau around her, the frost grass, the gray stone cottage, the ridge going gold in the morning sun, the wolves settled and patient in their circle. "I've been moving for 10 years, she said. "Following seasons, treating what I found. It has been useful and I don't regret it." She took a breath. "But I have not had a home." The word sat in the cold air between us. "Varath is disputed land," I said. "I will not pretend it is a simple place to settle. There is politics and there is patrol life, and there is the fact of what you now know about the bond." I looked at the mark on my wrist. "I will not use any of those things to press you toward a decision. But I want you to have the full picture before you make one." She looked at me for a long time. Then she looked at Bryn at her side. "He's been here every morning," she said, "since the 2nd week, before you arrived. He came to the door the first morning in October and sat down and wouldn't leave." A small pause. "I didn't know whose wolf he was. I thought perhaps he was lost." "Bryn," I said, "has not been lost in 3 centuries." The corner of her mouth moved, that almost smile I had noticed the first day. "No," she said, "I understand that now." I waited. I was good at waiting. 300 years had made me patient in the way only time can, the patience of someone who has learned that the things worth having cannot be hurried. "I would like," Saren said, "to stay." And there it was, simply said the way she said everything, not a declaration, not a performance. The truth, spoken cleanly, with the same lack of pretense she'd brought to every exchange between us. The wolves exhaled. This is not a figure of speech. The pack around us shifted, collectively, as though releasing a breath they had been holding, a long tension resolving. Lyra, Fenn's daughter, pressed her nose briefly against the back of Saren's hand and then withdrew, satisfied. I looked at this woman in the frost-silver pasture, with the mark burning warm and gold at my wrist and my oldest wolf at her side. And I felt, with a clarity that startled me, that I had been a long time arriving at this moment. "Then you will stay," I said. "On your own terms, not because of the bond and not because I say so, because you choose it." I paused. "We will move slowly. There is much to learn of each other, of what this means, of how Varath is managed. I will not hurry any of it." "I know how to be patient," she said. "I know," I said. "I watched you wrap a wolf's leg for 11 weeks. She looked at me, and this time the almost smile became a real one, quiet and warm and entirely her own. That afternoon, I sent a dispatch to my border captain at Ashenveld, informing him that the Varath settlement matter had resolved, that the occupant was authorized to remain on pack land under Healer's provision, and that the patrol wolves in Varath's circuit were to continue their current behavior without adjustment. This last line my captain would find puzzling, because he was not aware that my patrol wolves in Varath's circuit had changed their behavior at all. They were not, strictly speaking, reporting what they were doing. But I was not concerned. I knew what they were doing. They were sitting at a cottage door in shifts with the settled patience of wolves who have made a decision and intend to keep it. I spent that afternoon with Saren going over my treatment log she had kept, careful, thorough, methodical, a better record than most of my trained healers maintained. We talked about the plateau's plants, which she knew in a detail that suggested years of attention, and about the border patrol routing, which I explained because it seemed practical for her to understand it, and because talking with her was easy in a way that had stopped surprising me by now and simply was. Kara walked the pasture on her healing leg, slow and careful, and the autumn light came gold across the grass, and the wolves moved in and out of the cottage's shadow at will. I watched Bryn, in the late afternoon light, press his great head against Saren's knee while she talked, watched her hand settle in his fur without thinking, the reflex of someone comfortable with wolves, someone they have accepted. 300 years. Bryn had not done that in 300 years. I thought about the ways a life surprises you. I thought about arriving in a disputed land pasture to carry out a routine removal and finding, instead, something I had stopped expecting. Something I had not known I was still looking for, because I had done the honest calculus of 3 centuries and decided it was not going to come, and put the hoping away somewhere dark and filed it under things a king can manage without. The things a king can manage without, it turns out, are not the same as the things a wolf can manage without. My wolf had known this long before I caught up to it. The weeks that followed were a study in the particular patience required by things that are real. I returned to Ashenveld for the cycle of counsel and administration that governed pack life, border law, resource management, the Moldrath negotiation which continued in its measured, incremental way. I sent a second dispatch authorizing a stone repair of the Veyrath cottage, which my quartermaster Quirid and I confirmed without elaboration. I sent a third authorizing the delivery of healers' supplies to Veyrath on the next patrol run, and this one my quartermaster did not query, because by then word had moved through the upper council in the quiet, efficient way of pack knowledge, and people had begun to draw conclusions. I did not mind. Conclusions drawn from correct observations are useful. I went back to Veyrath 10 days later, and then again a fortnight after that. And then, gradually, more frequently, until the pattern of it became simply the pattern of my month. Saren was the same each time, consistent in the way that only people who are genuinely themselves are consistent, not performing steadiness, simply being steady. She had begun, by the second visit, to map Veyrath's plant life in a notebook she'd acquired from the patrol cache. She always replaced what she took, I was never surprised to discover. By the third visit she had identified 2 plants the pack's healers did not have in their records. We argued once mildly about patrol routing. She had a view, based on the wolves' movements, that the eastern circuit was missing a water source the pack could use in dry season. She was correct. I adjusted the route. She did not make anything of this. My council met her formally in the 4th week, when I brought her to Ashenveld for a supply discussion that could also reasonably be described as an introduction. My council was composed of wolves who had served with me for a combined 800 years, and they were not, as a group, people who were easily impressed by anything. They were impressed by Saren. Not because she tried, because she was direct and informed and had no interest in the court's particular social architecture, which she neither navigated nor disdained. She simply did not see it as particularly relevant to the question of what the Eastern Plateau's water sources could support. My council found this very straightforward. They were old enough to have tired of complication. My captain, who had been with me the longest and who had the privilege of a frankness that lesser members were wise not to attempt, said to me afterward, in private, "She is the first person I have seen in 40 years who makes Bryn's tail move." "I know," I said. "Bryn has not." "I know," I said. "I was there." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Good." It was not, in the way of these things, a sudden or dramatic course. The bond had announced itself in a moment of gold light and winter silver pasture, and that moment had been everything it should be, certain, unmistakable, quiet in the way that truly large things are quiet when they arrive. But what happened after that was slower and more ordinary, and in the way of what is ordinary deeper. I learned that she woke very early and worked best in the first quiet hours of the morning. I learned that she did not enjoy ceremony, but was genuinely interested in how things worked: pack law, territorial history, the logic of the patrol routes. I learned that she remembered everything, not in the way of someone performing memory, but in the way of someone who found the world interesting enough to pay attention to. She learned that I was better at patience than warmth, and worse at it than I pretended, that I found council meetings easy and small conversations less so, that Bryn was the most reliable guide to my actual state of mind because he had no interest in my official version of it. "He comes and sits near me," she said once, "when you are worried about something." I considered this. I did not know he did that. "He's done it 3 times, once the night before the Moldrath negotiation session, once when the South Pack sent the difficult letter," she paused, "and once when I had a fever and was not quite right for a few days." I looked at Bryn, who was asleep at the cottage hearthstone with an expression of complete uninvolvement in this conversation. "He does not generally report his movements to me," I said. "No," she agreed. "I think he considers himself autonomous." "He always has." I paused. "I'm glad he came." She looked at me across the room. "So am I." The Moldrath negotiation concluded in the early spring, an arrangement that ceded the east third of Veyrath to joint management, which was what I had wanted, and which left the cottage and the central plateau under Calder Pack jurisdiction, which Saren's presence had made considerably more urgent to secure than it had been the previous autumn. My captain raised an eyebrow when he read the final treaty terms. I did not offer comment. On the day the treaty was signed, I rode to Veyrath, not on formal business for once, but because I wanted to. The spring grass was coming in, pale green under the last of the frost, and the plateau smelled of earth turning and new growth and the particular freshness that follows a hard winter. Saren was in the pasture with 3 of the pack wolves and a basket of early spring herbs. She saw me coming and watched me ride in with that steady, assessing look of hers, and when I was close enough she said, "You look different." "The Moldrath Treaty is signed," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "That's not the only reason." It was not a question. She rarely asked questions in the form of questions. I dismounted. I stood a reasonable distance from her and looked at the plateau, at the grass coming in, at the stone cottage with its repaired walls and its new cache of healer's supplies, at the pack wolves moving easy and settled through the pasture as though this had always been their place. "I have been a king for a very long time," I said. "I have managed, I believe correctly, a great many things: pack law, territory, council politics, the particular mathematics of what is sustainable and what is not over a long enough horizon." I stopped. "I am less practiced at this." She waited. She was good at waiting. "I have been careful," I said, "with the time since October, because I wanted to be certain that what happened in this pasture was what I knew it to be, and not what I wanted it to be, and not something I was pressing toward because it was convenient." I paused. "I have been certain since November. I have been waiting to know if you were." She was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the south ridge, grass-scented and mild. "I know how to leave places," she said. "I've done it for 10 years. You pack what matters and you go, and eventually you stop counting what you left behind because the list gets too long." She looked at the pasture, at the wolves, at the cottage. "I have not wanted to leave here." She looked at me. "I have not wanted to leave since October. I was waiting, too, to be certain it was the place I wanted and not the situation." "The bond," I said. "The bond," she agreed. "I wanted to know that I would choose this if there were no bond. If I were simply a herb woman who had stayed too long on disputed land and met a king who came to move her on." I looked at her for a moment, and "I would choose this," she said, simply, truly, in the way she said everything that was true. I thought about what to say. Then I did something I had not done since my father's time, when I was still learning what it meant to lead rather than command. I said the plain thing, without the architecture of careful phrasing around it. "I would like you to come to Ashenveld," I said. "Not as a visitor, not on patrol schedule, as someone who belongs there." I paused. "That is not a command. It is not an obligation of the bond. It is a question, the most important question I have asked in a long time." She looked at me. Her eyes were the color of still water at dusk, and in them was the same thing I had seen the first morning, that quality of directness, of comfort with whatever came next, of a person who did not find the world's important moments frightening. "Yes," she said. One word entirely sufficient. We did not leave Verath immediately. There was no urgency now, and neither of us was the kind of person who does things for the drama of them. We spent 3 more days in order, the cache properly stocked and logged, the cottage sealed and the wolves notified in the way of packs, which is to say Bryn knew and therefore everyone knew. I watched Saren pack her things. She had been a traveler for 10 years and she knew how to pack quickly, efficiently, with the ruthlessness of someone who has long since distinguished between what matters and what does not. A notebook, a set of herb tools worn and well used, a length of cloth she'd been given somewhere and kept because it was warm, very little else. She paused at the hearthstone, her hand on the mantel, looking at the room. "The mat," I said, because I knew what she was looking at, where Kara was. "Yes," she glanced at me, "strange to leave it." "Kara has not," I said, "forgotten where she recovered." This was true. Kara ran Verath patrol in the new routing, but she still came, some mornings, to the cottage door and sat there for a while before resuming her circuit. My patrol captain had noted this in the log as customary behavior, reason unclear. I had not explained it. Saren smiled. "Will she find the cottage if it's sealed?" "She will find you," I said, "wherever you are." She looked at me for a moment, and there was something in her face that was very warm and very quiet. "That's true of all of them," she said. "Yes," I said. "It is." Ashenveld in spring was a different thing from Ashenveld in the business of winter council. The hold stone was warmer in the longer light, the wolves moved easier, the training yard ran later into the evening, and the whole place had the quality of a long breath released. Saren moved into it the way she moved into everything, without performance, without the anxious self-consciousness of someone trying to belong. She simply arrived and was herself, and the place arranged itself around her the way places arrange themselves around people who are genuinely at ease. My council, who had been in one way or another waiting since November for this development, were collectively satisfied in the particular way of very old wolves who have been correct about something. My captain said nothing directly, which with him was equivalent to a speech. The pack wolves mine, and the border wolves who rotated through Ashenveld on circuit, found her within the first week. This was not unexpected. Wolves are efficient with information they consider important. Within 10 days there were 2 or 3 pack wolves in whatever corner of the hold she was working in, at any given hour, arranged with the settled satisfaction of animals who have completed a task they found meaningful. I watched this with a feeling that had no name beyond rightness, the particular rightness of a thing being as it should be, after a long time of it being otherwise. I watched Bryn, who had come with us to Ashenveld and showed no interest in returning to his customary post at the hold's gate, establish himself permanently at the healer's workroom, where Saren spent most mornings. He fit there with the authority of an animal who has decided something is his. I watched the pack heal. The mite complaint, treated in the eastern wolves with Saren's lavender clove preparation and the den ground clearing she'd prescribed, was gone before summer. 2 wolves who had not been thriving on the western circuit improved under her attention in ways my healer's records noted with careful professional neutrality, and my captain noted in his own log with less neutrality. I watched her most carefully of all. I watched the way she was consistent, honest, steady. The same in the healer's room and in the council hall, and on the plateau patrol she ran with me twice a month. The same in the small, ordinary hours of a shared life, as she was in the moments that mattered. I thought, sometimes, about October, about riding into a frost-silver plateau with an expulsion order and finding 3 of my wolves at a stranger's door, already decided, about the particular arrogance of arriving to remove something that had already been recognized by the parts of me that knew better than I did. My wolf, which had spent 3 centuries patient and waiting in ways I had not always acknowledged, had no comment on this. It simply hummed, warm and settled, in the way of something that has arrived where it was always going. There is a moment in the way of the mate bond that is not the first flare of the mark, not the gold light and the catch of breath and the recognition. That is only the announcement. The moment that is different, the one that stays, is smaller and quieter and arrives later. For me, it arrived in the Ashenveld healer's room on a night in high summer, when I had come in late from a border council meeting to find Saren still at her workbench with the lamplight warm on her face and 3 wolves asleep at her feet. And she had looked up at me the way a person looks at someone they know well, not performing gladness, simply experiencing it, the way you experience the right end of a long day. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I came in and sat in the chair I had taken to sitting in when I was in the workroom, which was not a thing I had done much before October, but was a thing I now did with the regularity of something that had always been true. Bryn, without opening his eyes, moved his tail once. Saren set down the instrument she'd been cleaning and looked at me. How was the council? Long, I said. Productive. The East Patrol restructuring is approved. Good. She meant it. She always meant it when she asked about the Pax business, which she understood now in significant detail and took seriously as something that mattered. The Moldrath joint management question, did they settle the water source dispute? In principle, I paused. Pending the survey, which you recommended. The survey is correct, stated without vanity, simply true. It is, I said. My captain agrees. He was less forthcoming about whether the recommendation from a herb woman with no formal council standing was appropriate protocol. And you said? I said the recommendation was correct, and the protocol question could be addressed separately. She looked at me. That is very diplomatic. I am a very diplomatic king, I said, except when I am not. The corner of her mouth moved. I looked at her in the lamplight, in the healer's room that had become, gradually and naturally, the room in the hold where the most important things happened, where the wolves were, and the work, and the particular kind of honest conversation that does not require performance of any kind. I want to say something, I said, that I should probably have said earlier. She waited. The bond announced itself in October, I said, and I told you at the time what it was and what it meant, and I told you that what you chose was yours. That remains true. I paused. But I want to say, separately from the bond, separately from what the mark and the wolves and the fate of it all says, that I am grateful for the particular way you are. I stopped and found better words. You are honest and careful, and you do not perform things you do not feel. You replace what you borrow. You treat what you find. You were not afraid of me on the first morning, but you were not reckless either. You were simply yourself, which is a rarer thing than I have encountered in 300 years. She was very still, listening. I have been a king long enough, I said, to know that the bond is a beginning and not an ending, that what comes after it is built, not found. I looked at her. I am glad to be building it with you. She held my eyes for a long moment. Then she said, I would like to say something that I should probably have said earlier. Yes, I said. I have been moving for 10 years, she said, and in 10 years I have not trusted easily. I came to Veyrath because there was a wolf who needed attention and I had nothing else pressing. I stayed because I could not leave a wolf mid-treatment. She paused. But I have also stayed since October and at Ashenveld and here because of you. She said this simply, without embellishment or hedging. Not because of the bond, because you told me clearly that the bond was not a command, because you gave me time. Because you are honest in the way that people are honest when they have been doing it long enough to know it is the only sustainable strategy. A pause. And because Bryn chose you. I glanced at Bryn. Bryn's eyes were open now, watching us both with that grave, particular attention of his. That is, I said, probably the most reliable reference I could have. I thought so too, she said. The mite complaint did not return. The East Patrol wolves were healthy through the winter, and the spring after, and the spring after that. The Moldrath joint management of Veyrath's East Third held better, in practice, than the treaty language had suggested it would, because Saren made a point of building a working relationship with Moldrath's healer through the border station at the plateau's edge, and pack-level relationships built between healers tend to outlast pack-level politics between councils. My captain noted this in his annual report. I noted it privately as a thing that had not happened in 3 decades of managed Moldrath relations. Veyrath became, by the second winter, an established healer's station, not a full pack seat, but a recognized place, a named point on the pack's maps, a location my border wolves knew was safe and provisioned and watched over. The cottage's repair was completed, and a second room added, which my quartermaster approved without query because he had by then a much better understanding of the strategic logic of the Veyrath position. Kara ran patrol from Veyrath's new station and came to the healer's room when she needed attention, which she did with the frankness of a wolf who has decided this is the appropriate use of the relationship. Bryn was between Ashenveld and Veyrath on what appeared to be a rotation of his own devising, which I did not examine closely, because the result was that he was where he needed to be, which was a reliable characteristic of Bryn's judgment. I was at Veyrath for the autumn equinox in the second year, which I had made a practice of. Saren was in the pasture, late afternoon, with the gold light on the frost grass and 3 wolves, and a list of late-harvest herbs she was recording in the plateau journal she'd been keeping since the first spring. I sat on the pasture wall and watched her work. She knew I was watching. She had always been comfortable being watched in the way of people who are not performing anything. The watching is just company, not scrutiny. After a while she looked up. Bryn is behind you. I turned. Bryn had settled himself against the cottage wall behind my position, in the precise patch of sun remaining, with his chin on his paws and his silver eyes half-closed in an expression of perfect contentment. He follows the sun, I said, in autumn. He follows useful warmth, she said, in any season. I looked at Bryn. I thought about October, about finding him at this door in this pasture in the early frost, with that small, deliberate movement of his tail, about how certain he had been before I had known enough to be certain of anything. He was right, I said. Saren looked at me. The autumn light caught the warmth in her face and the steadiness in her eyes and the green herb stain at her fingernails, which did not come entirely off even in high summer, and I thought again that I had been a long time arriving here, and that the arrival had been exactly right. He was right, she agreed. Bryn's tail in the afternoon sun moved once, slow and certain the way he moved everything. 300 years, and not once for anyone but her. He had known since October. He was always correct.